If You Leave Me Now was Chicago's first ever #1 hit in America. It was nothing like anything they had previously released, and it changed their sound forever. That's not to say the previous music wasn't good, because it was good, and very popular. It's just that this different sound resonated in a way they hadn't seen before. The group formed in Chicago in 1967 on February 15th. That's my birthday, by the way. They were originally called The Big Thing and were made up of a guitarist, a saxophonist, a drummer, a trombonist, trumpet player, and a vocalist/keyboard player. Later on, they recruited bass player and tenor Peter Cetera. He's sort of the main character in this story. More on him later. They had the great idea to combine rock music with horn instruments. They had a very solid brass section, after all, and people rather liked it. So much so that they became very in demand, playing local clubs, covering top 40 hits. A year later, they started dabbling in writing original songs, moved to LA and signed to Columbia Records with a brand new name, the Chicago Transit Authority. And soon, they released their debut album. We were lucky to have formed in an era when people wanted to hear something a little different. That was their debut single, and as you can probably hear, very different to how we know Chicago today. I mean, nowadays, Chicago is known for soft rock, ballads. If You Leave Me Now being a prime example of this. But the stuff they were putting out in those early years was much more experimental. It was jazzy, rocky, bluesy, much more lively. But Peter Cetera was never a real fan of that sort of music. Peter has said in interviews that he never really felt like he was part of the group back then, but he didn't want to be out of work, so he saw it as just a job. And by the way, they shortened their name to Chicago after that debut album because they were threatened with legal action by the actual Chicago Transit Authority. That's a true story. By the album Chicago 5 in 1972, they had found their musical voice, with Saturday in the Park giving them their highest charting single yet. Again, nothing like If You Leave Me Now. But it helped push the album all the way to #1, and it stayed there for 5 weeks. So things were looking good on the surface. But as often is the case in these stories, things weren't so good behind the scenes. Drugs and alcohol had become a major problem for the band members, and there were pretty severe ego clashes as well. And remember, they were still kids really at this point, all in their 20s. Becoming such big stars at that age would have been difficult. Although I imagine that would have been much, much worse if their pictures had appeared on any of their albums. You see, all of Chicago's albums only featured the logo of the band, no photos of the members. While it might have just been an innocent stylistic and branding decision, some people, Peter Cetera included, believe it was a way for their manager, Jim Guercio, and their label to control the band to an extent. The idea being that the fact their faces weren't on the album sleeves meant they were replaceable. It's another reason why the band kept their mouths shut about so many things. And it gave the impression that Chicago was just this musical commodity, pumping out albums for the money. But the truth is, behind those albums were genuinely talented musicians pouring their heart and soul into every song. There was a lot of singers and writers in that band trying to lead the direction of the music. At least until Chicago 10 came around, and more specifically, If You Leave Me Now. This was the moment that changed Chicago forever. Remember how I said Peter Cetera wasn't a big fan of the music of Chicago in those earlier years? Well, no surprise then that he was the one who wrote If You Leave Me Now. Incredibly, this song was added to Chicago 10 as a last-minute addition. And I think that's perfectly plausible given how out of place it feels on that album. I mean, listen to the opener. Or the album's other high-performing single, Another Rainy Day in New York. It's another rainy day, just a rainy day. And then listen to If You Leave Me Now. If you leave me now, you take away the very heart of me. Where are all the horns, and the energy, and the bounciness? This was the first Chicago single to feature an acoustic guitar as the lead instrument, and that guitar was played by the producer and manager, James Garcia. He had recorded it on the demo as a placeholder, but they figured it worked fine and kept it on the track. Surely that's decent evidence that the song was indeed a last-minute addition, right? And even more evidence of that is that Walter Parazada, who was one of the founding members of Chicago, didn't seem to know it was added to the album. There's a famous story he told about hearing the song on the radio for the first time and thinking it was a Paul McCartney song. He didn't realise it was his own band. And you can't blame him. The song is incredibly different to anything they had ever put out. It only features a French horn in the brass section, a subtle one at that. And this was a band known for their formidable brass section. In fact, Jimi Hendrix once described their brass section as sharing the same lungs, something along those lines. And yet, here was a soft rock ballad. Robert Lamb later said a lot of the band members resented it because it wasn't a cool song. Beautiful, sure, but not cool. Not for them. It was completely un-Chicago, and yet it was a massive success. 2 Grammy Awards, a nomination for Record of the Year, constant radio play, and of course it was their first #1. The record label liked this a lot, and from there Peter Cetera essentially became the face and main creative force of the band as the label pushed for more and more Cetera songs, ballads. Robert Lamb, who had been a main songwriter for the band, creatively dried up by the mid to late 70s, substance abuse being a big part of that. No surprise that the big hit from their next album was the ballad Baby What a Big Surprise. And their next #1 came in 1982 with the power ballad Hard to Say I'm Sorry. While the band were finding a new audience and a huge amount of success, it was difficult for certain members of the band. James Pankow, for example, member of the famous horn section and founding member of Chicago, said he had to constantly battle to get their horns higher in the mixes from then on. Chicago, with heavy persuasion from the record label, had essentially become a Peter Cetera-fronted hit ballad-producing band. The band stopped making musical statements and documenting where we were as composers. It began to be more premeditated. We were gunslingers. People wanted hits. Chicago's sound had changed. Whether or not that was a good or bad thing is for you to argue about in the comments. What's clear is that it didn't exactly help the tension that was already there in the band. Jim Garcia was sacked after Chicago 11. They had simply had enough of his demands. The biggest blow, though, would come shortly after Chicago 11. Terry Kath, one of the main parts of the Chicago sound, and in many ways the glue that held the band together, tragically died. According to Peter Cetera, Kath was struggling in Chicago and thinking of leaving the group. He went off on a 3-day drug-fueled bender and unintentionally shot himself at a party. Had Terry survived and been a part of Chicago as it went into the 1980s, this band's history would have been very different. Terry would have opposed the balladic direction that we were sucked into. He'd put a stop to that, or he'd have left the band. In 1985, with tensions rising around touring schedules, Pete Cetera left the band and found incredible success as a solo artist. And Chicago ploughed on as a ballad band, still to this day. And all of this reminds me of the story of Fleetwood Mac's Tusk album. They too were under so much pressure to replicate the sound and success of the very popular Rumours album. Except in this story, they said no. It went a bit rogue. I think you'll enjoy that video. It's over there for you to watch next.